In a small village in southern Africa, there lived a girl named Aisha. Her name meant life in the local dialect, and she seemed to be the personification of that word. Aisha grew up in a poor but close-knit family where traditions and customs were passed down from generation to generation. Her parents, Mame and Baba, were simple people who earned their living by farming and small crafts. They had little wealth, but lived with a sense of deep affection for each other and for their children. Aisha was the third of 5 children. Her older brothers had long been working on the plantations to help support the family, while her younger sisters were still at the local school. Despite the difficult living conditions, Aisha always stood out among the other girls with her bright energy and natural beauty. Her skin was the color of dark chocolate, her eyes were as deep as the African night, and her smile could light up even the darkest day. Her thick black hair, braided into neat pigtails, always rested neatly on her shoulders, emphasizing her natural grace. But it wasn't just her outer beauty that made Aisha special. She had an indomitable spirit and a remarkable mind. From childhood she was wise and inquisitive. Her mother often said that Aisha was born under a lucky star, because her vitality and optimism were extraordinary for a child growing up in such conditions. Despite her poverty, she always believed that her life was not confined to the confines of the village, that somewhere beyond her little world there was a vast amount of opportunity and adventure. Aisha often dreamed of how she would break free from her village, how she would discover the world. At times, when her duties at home allowed, she would spend hours reading old books she had managed to get from one of her teachers. Her knowledge was modest, but she greedily absorbed everything new. Reading was not only a way for her to learn about other countries and cultures, but also an escape from a reality where every day was similar to the previous one. Aisha's family was tight-knit but strictly adhered to tradition. The father was in charge of the house and his word was law. He brought up his children according to ancient customs, where obedience and respect for elders were the most important virtues. Aisha, despite her independence and thirst for new things, always respected her parents and tried not to break the established rules. She understood that their traditions were an integral part of their lives, and to break them would mean breaking the harmony in the family. Inwardly, however, she felt that her calling lay beyond the traditional roles prescribed to her by society. Her heart yearned for freedom, for autonomy, for the opportunity to choose her own path. But she could not ignore her love and attachment to her family, which created an internal conflict that tore her apart. Aisha realized that her dreams and ambitions might never come true if she stayed in the village and followed the traditional path. Her attitude towards life and people was different from the conventional way. Aisha was always open to new ideas, to people who were different from her. She was the one who was the first to lend a helping hand, who could listen and support in a difficult moment. Her kindness and responsiveness were widely known and she was often consulted. She was respected in the village, but at the same time was wary of her desire to go beyond the ordinary. Some saw it as a threat to the way of life, while others admired her courage and unusual view of the world. Aisha never fully knew her place in the world. She loved her family, her village, but in her heart she always dreamed of something more. Her younger sisters looked up to her as a role model. Her brothers protected her and always tried to support her in times of need. But even they could not always understand her inner aspirations and desires. At such times, Aisha would go to the bank of the river, which flowed not far from the village. Here, amidst the murmuring water and rustling trees, she found peace and was free to dream. She imagined how she would travel, how she would discover new horizons. Sometimes she wondered if she would meet someone who would understand her, who would share her dreams and desires. Aisha knew that for a girl of her age and position, the future was determined by marriage. Her parents were already beginning to look for a groom for her among the local boys. Her father wanted her to marry a decent man who could provide her with a stable future. But Aisha's heart did not lie with these plans. She wanted more than just to be a wife and mother in her village. Her soul yearned for adventure, exploration, and perhaps love, but love that was based on mutual understanding and shared aspirations. Aisha's approach to life did not always resonate with her family. Her mother sometimes noticed with concern that her daughter was becoming more and more withdrawn, spending more time in daydreaming and thinking. She tried to gently guide her to the idea of following tradition, but she could not make Aisha's heart fully accept it. Thus, Aisha found herself at a crossroads between her duty to her family and her own dreams and ambitions. Her heart yearned for freedom and new discoveries, but she realized that these dreams could destroy everything she had known and loved so far. Her journey to self-determination and finding her own destiny was just beginning, but Aisha already sensed that it would not be an easy road. It was at this moment in her life that Aisha met the man who would change her destiny forever, and this meeting would be the beginning of a complex but amazing journey that would lead her to unexpected challenges and discoveries. Aisha continued to live her ordinary life in the village, but dreams of another, bigger world never left her mind. Her days passed in the usual routine, working in the fields, helping her mother around the house, taking care of her younger sisters. In the evenings, she read books by the light of an oil lamp, immersing herself in worlds she could only dream of. But one day her life changed forever. One sunny day, as village life went on, a group of strangers arrived in the village. They were city folk, dressed in modern clothes, with expensive accessories that immediately caught the attention of the locals. They arrived in large, shiny suits that gave the impression of power and luxury. It turned out that these men had come to the village on business. They were part of a team that was building a new infrastructure project in the region. Aisha, like everyone else, watched the newcomers with curiosity. She had never seen people like this before. Their mannerisms, their clothes, their cars, it all seemed unusual and fascinating to her. One in particular caught her attention, a young man with a confident gait and a charming smile. He was slightly above average height, with a strong build and swarthy skin. His eyes glowed with life and energy, something in his gaze, betraying a depth of thought and life experience rarely found in people his age. His name was Adam. He had come to the village as part of a delegation to oversee the construction work. Despite his status, he was remarkably easy to talk to, often joking and smiling, easily striking up conversations with the locals and listening to their opinions. Unlike the rest of the group, he seemed genuinely interested in people's lives and problems. Aisha first met Adam on the riverbank, where she often went to be alone with her thoughts. That day she was sitting on a rock by the water, enjoying the fresh air and the silence. Suddenly she heard footsteps and looked up. Standing in front of her was Adam, who had apparently decided to take a walk and had accidentally stumbled upon her hiding place.
Hi.
He smiled, slightly surprised by her presence in such a quiet place.
No. Do you mind if I join you?
Aisha was confused, not knowing how to react to such an unexpected appearance, but she nodded politely. Her heart beat faster. She'd never socialized with people from the big city before, much less with someone who looked so important and self-assured.
It's really beautiful here.
Adam remarked, looking around.
Do you come here often?
Yes.
Aisha answered quietly, still feeling a little insecure.
This is my favorite place. It's a place to think and relax.
I understand.
He nodded, taking a seat next to her.
I like places like this too. They help me remember what's important in life.
So began their first conversation, which, as it turned out, would be the beginning of a long and unexpected relationship. Adam and Aisha talked for a long time, as if they were old friends who just needed to catch up on lost time. Adam talked about his life in the city, his projects, and how difficult it was sometimes to keep up with responsibilities. Aisha, in turn, shared her thoughts about life in the village, her dreams and desires.
You're not like the others here.
Adam said after a long silence.
You have something that makes you special.
No. Special.
Aisha interjected, surprised by his words.
Yes.
Adam looked her straight in the eye.
Your inner strength and dreams. That's rare. People usually accept their fate without seeking to change it, but not you.
Aisha was deeply moved by these words. She felt as if finally someone understood her, saw what she had been hiding for so long, even from herself. There was a feeling in her heart that she couldn't fully realize, but it was pleasant and frightening at the same time. From then on, they began to spend a lot of time together. Adam would often come to the riverbank where they would meet and talk about life, the future, and what it meant to be free and independent. He would tell Aisha about a world she had never seen, and his stories filled her mind with new dreams and aspirations. Although their meetings became more frequent and longer, Aisha still didn't know who Adam really was. She saw him simply as a kind and interesting man who brought a fresh breeze into her life. Adam didn't reveal his secrets either, preferring to enjoy the simple joy of being with a girl who didn't judge him on his looks or wealth. One day, when they met again by the river, Aisha plucked up the courage to ask a question.
Adam, why do you spend so much time here in the village? You could be anywhere.
He smiled, looking at her warmly.
You're right. I could have been anywhere, but this is where I found what I was looking for. Do you think living in a big city brings happiness? Sometimes simple things like this riverbank and the company of an interesting person are far more valuable than all material goods.
Those words made Aisha think. She realized that Adam wasn't just a city dweller who was here on business. There was something more to him, but what it was she didn't know yet. Their relationship developed gradually but surely. Each new day brought new discoveries and insights. They spent more and more time together, and it seemed that an invisible but strong bond had formed between them. Aisha felt that with Adam she could be herself, that she had found a man who accepted her as she was, with her dreams, doubts, and fears. However, despite the warmth of their relationship, Aisha couldn't shake the feeling that Adam was hiding something. He was too perfect, too mysterious. But every time she tried to ask questions about his past or his life in the city, Adam would only evade direct answers, turning the conversation to other topics. But one day, everything changed. It was one of those days when Adam suddenly disappeared from the village for a few days. Aisha was worried, but tried not to show her anxiety. She understood that he was busy, that he had his own things to do, but her heart was still restless. When he finally returned, he looked different. There was some heaviness in his eyes, and he was noticeably more silent than usual. Aisha sensed that something had happened, but didn't know how to start a conversation.
Hey Aisha,
He began at last, after a long pause.
I have something to tell you.
She froze, waiting for his words, feeling her heart clench with foreboding.
All this time I've been hiding the truth from you.
Adam continued.
I'm not just a builder or an engineer. I own the company that's building this project here. What's more, I'm one of the youngest billionaires in the country.
Adam's words stunned Aisha. She couldn't believe her ears. Her friend, the man she thought was simple and kind, turned out to be a billionaire. The world in front of her eyes began to spin, and she felt the ground go out from under her feet.
But why didn't you tell me before?
She whispered, unable to hide her emotions.
I didn't want you to see me only as a rich man.
Adam replied, with pain in his voice.
I wanted you to know me for who I really am. And wealth, it's only a part of my life, not the main thing.
Aisha stood, realizing everything he had said. Her feelings were mixed. On the one hand, she was stunned. On the other, she felt that Adam was still the same man she knew. His confession had opened up a new world to her, but she realized that now their relationship would never be the same. This revelation was a turning point in their history. Aisha had an important decision to make, whether she would accept Adam for who he was or back away, afraid that their worlds were too different to be together. After Adam's confession, Aisha's life changed. Her feelings became more complicated. Every day was filled with thoughts about the future and how she should live her life. Aisha couldn't shake off her inner turmoil. On the one hand, she was happy that she had met a man like Adam. On the other, she was frightened by the difference in their situation and his wealth, which she felt created an unbridgeable gap between them. Despite her doubts, Aisha continued to date Adam. Their relationship grew deeper, and the girl gradually began to trust him. Adam proved to be a caring and attentive partner who respected her and her wishes. He didn't pressure her, giving her time and space to make sense of everything that was happening. But soon something happened that turned Aisha's life upside down again. She woke up one morning feeling very weak and dizzy. Initially, she thought it was just fatigue or a mild ailment caused by stress. However, when these symptoms began to recur every day, she suspected something wrong. Aisha tried not to pay much attention to it, but her body was telling her that something important was going on. A few weeks went by and Aisha noticed that her cycle was not on time. This caused her to have serious concerns. She knew her body wasn't fooling her, and she realized that this could only mean one thing: she was pregnant. At first, panic gripped her. As soon as the thought crossed her mind, she felt her heart race. Aisha was terrified. She wasn't ready for this, for her life was already full of uncertainty. Aisha realized that this news would change everything. She was unmarried, and in her village, pregnancy outside of marriage was considered a huge disgrace. Her parents had always adhered to strict traditions, and she knew their reaction would be extremely negative. Deep down, she was afraid that they might turn their backs on her, especially if they found out that the father of her child was a rich man who didn't belong to their circle. The girl spent several days in complete confusion, not knowing what to do. Her thoughts were filled with fears and anxieties. How would she be able to raise the child alone? What would her parents and siblings say when they found out? Would she be able to continue her relationship with Adam when all of this came to light? Her life, which was already full of uncertainty, became even more unpredictable. A few days later, plucking up courage, Aisha decided to take a pregnancy test. It confirmed her worst fears: she was indeed pregnant. When she saw the positive result, she couldn't hold back her tears. She sat on the floor of her room, holding the test in her hands and sobbing, not knowing what to do next. That night, Aisha couldn't sleep. She lay in her small bed, listening to the silence of the night, and tried to make sense of everything that had happened. Her thoughts darted from one thing to another. She knew she had to tell Adam, but she was afraid of his reaction. What if he wanted nothing to do with her after this? What if he offered her money to solve the problem, as rich people sometimes do? Aisha couldn't even think about that, because she knew she couldn't go for that. What scared her the most, however, was her parents' reaction. Aisha had grown up in a family where tradition and honor were more important than anything else. Her father was a strict and demanding man who always expected his children to obey and uphold family values. He often reiterated that their honor was their most precious possession, and that any act that could tarnish it would be unforgivable. Aisha realized that her pregnancy out of wedlock would be a huge blow to her parents. In their eyes, she had broken every rule they lived by. She imagined how disappointed and angry her father would be, how her mother would cry with shame and grief. It seemed to her that their love and support would be lost forever, that only loneliness and judgment awaited her. Finally, Aisha decided that she had to tell Adam everything. She couldn't keep it to herself much longer. The next day, when they met by the river, Aisha gathered all her will in her fist and said,
Adam, there's something I have to tell you. It's very important.
He noticed her serious tone and looked at her carefully.
Of course, Aisha. What's wrong?
Aisha sighed, gathering her thoughts, and said quietly,
I'm pregnant.
The words came out of the blue. Adam froze, his face serious, but he immediately stepped closer and took her hands in his.
Aisha, this is unexpected,
he said at last, trying not to show his confusion.
but we'll get through this. I promise you.
Aisha stared at him, not believing her ears. She had expected everything, but not such calmness and confidence from him.
You're not angry? You don't want to leave me?
Her voice trembled with tension.
Of course not. Meth,
Adam answered firmly, looking into her eyes.
we're in this together. I'm not going to let you go through this alone.
Those words calmed Aisha a little, but the fear of her parents' reaction still remained. She knew that in their world, Adam's wealth didn't matter. On the contrary, It could only make things worse. But she also realized that hiding the truth from them would be even worse. It was several days before Aisha plucked up the courage to tell her parents about her pregnancy. She thought for a long time about the best way to approach this conversation. Finally, she decided to just tell the truth, hoping for their understanding and support, although deep down she realized that their reaction might not be what she hoped for. One night, when the whole family gathered for dinner, Aisha felt it was time. Her heart was racing and her hands were shaking, but she knew there was no retreating. When they had finished eating, she said quietly,
Mama, Baba, I have something to tell you. It's very important.
Her parents turned to her, sensing her tension. Her father frowned, looking at his daughter.
What's wrong, Aisha?
He asked, his voice sounding stern. Aisha began, trying not to cry.
I'm pregnant.
The silence in the room became deafening. Aisha's mother covered her mouth with her hand, as if she couldn't believe what she was hearing, and her father clenched his fists with force, his face pale with anger.
How could you? Bah.
He hissed, unable to contain his emotions. You have tarnished our honor. Who is he? Who is this scoundrel? Aisha felt the world crumbling around her. She tried to explain that the father of her child was Adam, a man who cared for her and was willing to take responsibility. But those words only made her father even angrier.
That rich man.
He shouted, getting up from his seat.
Does he think he can buy everything, even your honor? We will not let him humiliate our family.
The mother, crying, tried to calm her husband, but he wouldn't listen. He announced that Aisha was no longer his daughter, that she had broken all the rules and no longer had the right to live under his roof. Aisha was shocked. She expected her parents to be angry, but she didn't think her father would dare to take such a cruel step. Aisha was thrown out of the house the same night. Her mother, though she tried to protect her daughter, was powerless before the will of her husband. The girl was left alone, with a baby growing inside her, and with the unknown that awaited her ahead. Aisha realized that now she would have to cope with everything on her own, but she also knew that she had Adam, who promised to support her no matter what. When Aisha decided to tell her parents about her pregnancy, she realized that she was in for a difficult conversation. However, despite her inner fear, she hoped for some understanding from her parents, albeit with judgment. She thought long and hard about how to approach this conversation, and finally decided that honesty was the only way out. In the evening, when the whole family gathered in the house after a day's work, Aisha felt the moment had come. Her heart was pounding frantically, but she knew she couldn't drag it out any longer. She began to speak, slowly and carefully, first trying to prepare her parents for what she was about to say, and then she quietly and firmly admitted that she was pregnant. Her parents' reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Aisha's mother immediately turned pale, her eyes filled with tears. She could not believe that her daughter, who had always been an example of obedience and virtue to her, was in this position. Her pain was caused not only by the fact of the pregnancy, but also by the realization that it would bring shame to the whole family. The father, however, reacted differently. His face contorted with anger as he felt everything he had believed in and worked for all his life crumble. In his eyes, Aisha had betrayed not only their trust, but also the age-old traditions their family had lived by for generations. In their society, pregnancy outside of marriage was considered not just a violation of the rules, but a grave sin that could ruin a family's reputation forever. Every move they made, every decision they made, would now be judged through the prism of that shame. The father, trembling with rage, did not hide his feelings. He sharply expressed what he thought, accusing Aisha of ruining not only her life but also the reputation of the family. In his eyes, she was not just a mistake, but the cause of their shame that could never be atoned for. Her father turned his back on her, saying that she could no longer be considered his daughter. He made a decision that seemed to him to be the only solution to the situation. Aisha must leave their home, so that her shame would not overshadow the lives of the rest of the family. Aisha, though she expected an angry reaction, was stunned by the cruelty of this decision. Her mother, though shocked, dared not cross her husband, knowing that his decision was final. Her face was contorted with anguish, but she could do nothing to change the situation. Her desperation and fear for her family's future made her silently agree with her husband, even though her heart was torn to pieces. Aisha was thrown out of the house the same night. Her parents left her with only the bare necessities, showing her that she had to manage on her own from now on. She left the home that had been her only shelter and support. Now she was alone in this cruel world. Her own blood and family had turned their backs on her, choosing honor and tradition over love and support. After Aisha was forced to leave home, her life changed dramatically. She was left alone, without support or understanding. With a baby under her heart and great uncertainty ahead of her, she was terrified of the future, because now she had not only to live, but also to take care of the child, with no financial stability or support from her loved one. The first days after the exile were particularly difficult. Aisha wandered around the village, not knowing where to go. She tried to find shelter with relatives, but everyone turned their backs on her for fear of shame and condemnation from the community. Even those who had once been her friends now looked at her with judgment or pity, but no one dared to help her. The loneliness that overtook Aisha seemed insurmountable. She had to seek shelter at an old abandoned hut on the outskirts of the village, where she settled down. The hut was dilapidated and cold, but it was the only place she could take shelter from the weather and evil tongues. Aisha tried to tidy it up with her own hands, doing her best to create at least minimal living conditions. But her resources were extremely limited, and every day she faced new difficulties. Financial problems were another heavy blow. Aisha had no job and no means of livelihood. All the money she could earn was needed for the simplest of necessities: food, clothing, and basic needs. Pregnancy, on the other hand, made her life even more difficult. Every day her body demanded more and more rest and nourishment, but she couldn't afford the luxury of taking care of herself. Every morning, Aisha woke up with a heavy weight in her heart. She had to struggle to survive despite her fatigue and fear. She tried to find a job, but no one wanted to hire her. A pregnant girl who was also dishonored by her family. Aisha tried her best to hide her pain and despair, but every day her loneliness became more unbearable. Ideas about the future that had seemed distant to her only a few months ago were now a reality. She thought about how she would raise her child. If she didn't have enough food or a roof over her head, she was afraid that she would not be able to give him a decent life, that he would suffer the same fate as she had, to be rejected and lonely. Her inner world was shattered, and she had to pick herself up in pieces every day to move on. Loneliness became her constant companion. She had no one to share her thoughts and fears with, no one to support her in her time of need. Aisha felt disconnected from the world that had once been her home. People looked at her with disdain or pity, but no one reached out to her. She was an outcast, a stranger in her own village, and that sense of alienation weighed on her the most. Sometimes Aisha thought of going back to Adam, telling him everything and asking for help, but her pride and fear of being rejected held her back again. She didn't want him to think she was weak or using her position for gain. She wanted to manage on her own, to show that she was capable of more, even if it seemed. Aisha lived in a constant struggle with herself and the world around her. Every day was a test, and she didn't know how long she could withstand the pressure. But in her heart, she realized that she had to keep going, for the sake of her child, who had already become a part of her life. Despite all the pain and difficulties, Aisha did not allow herself to give up. She knew that her journey was not over yet, and that new challenges, but also new opportunities. After Aisha was cast out of her home and left to fend for herself, her life became incredibly difficult and lonely. But in this darkness that consumed her, there was one bright memory: Adam, that mysterious man with whom she had spent some of the happiest months of her life. At the time, Aisha couldn't have imagined that her feelings for him would grow into something more, and their relationship would prove to be the beginning of great change. However, until recently, Aisha didn't know all the details about him and certainly didn't suspect his true identity. After being banished from her family, Aisha had avoided seeing Adam at all costs. She was afraid that her plight would make him feel pity, or worse, contempt, but her heart continued to reach out to him. Despite her decision to pull away, fate seemed to have plans. One day, when Aisha was trying to find some work, she happened to meet one of Adam's acquaintances downtown. The man, dressed in an expensive suit, clearly knew Aisha. Though she didn't recognize him, he greeted her, called her by name, and began to talk about Adam being concerned about her absence. Aisha couldn't understand how this man could know about her, but she sensed that there was more to this encounter than mere coincidence. A few days later, Aisha was once again faced with the unexpected. She was offered a job that seemed too good to be true. Her employer said he heard about her from a friend who praised her hard work and resilience. Aisha was surprised, for no one around her knew of her present situation, and she couldn't think of anyone who could recommend her for such a job. As Aisha tried to get used to her new job and make sense of the mysterious events, even stranger coincidences began to surround her. Several times, while driving home late at night, she noticed luxury cars driving by. These cars clearly didn't belong to any of her poor neighbors. At first, Aisha didn't pay much attention to this, but soon she began to notice that every time these cars appeared, someone she knew would mention that Mr. Who was taking care of her. Aisha began to realize that Adam could be behind all of these events, but why and how remained a mystery. She knew him as a kind and caring man, but his real position had always remained a mystery to her. Memories of his unusual restraint and courtesy began to surface in her mind as hints that she had missed something. One day, while working in a small diner, Aisha happened to overhear a conversation between two customers. They were discussing a major charity project that was being funded by an unknown billionaire. One of them mentioned that this man always tries to stay in the shadows, despite his wealth. Aisha felt her heart race when they called out the name. Adam. She was amazed. Was this really her Adam? Doubts remained, however. The name could have been a mere coincidence, and her suspicions a figment of her imagination. But more and more facts began to come to. She began to analyze everything she knew about Adam. His restraint, his manners, his ability to spend money on expensive gifts, and the fact that he never talked about his work or family. Aisha began to look for more information about Adam, asking mutual acquaintances about him. Slowly, she began to realize that he could indeed be the billionaire that was the talk of the town. More and more little things were beginning to confirm her hunch. She learned that his name was associated with big business projects and philanthropic initiatives across the country. This was a man who, she thought, lived in another world, far removed from her poverty and struggles. Aisha began to realize that her relationship with Adam was far more complicated than she had realized. She remembered how attentive he had always been to her, how he had tried to understand her problems without asking too many questions. She was amazed at his ability to be so close, and yet remain distant, as if he knew that if she knew the truth, everything would change. Soon an incident occurred that finally confirmed her hunch. On her way home from work one evening, Aisha noticed a figure standing at the door of her ramshackle cabin in the distance. It was Adam. He was dressed simply but still stood out with his posture and confidence. As Aisha stepped closer, she saw that Adam had brought her food and necessities. The gesture, though simple, held deep meaning. In his eyes she saw the same concern he had shown earlier, but now she knew there was much more behind that concern. Adam offered her help that she could not have accepted from a mere man. It was help that only a man with vast resources and influence could offer. It was then that Aisha finally realized who he really was. This kind and considerate man she knew was not just an ordinary man. He was a billionaire, a man whose name was known all over the world, but who preferred to remain in the shadows. This news shook Aisha to the core. She began to realize that their relationship had been built on secrets that were now coming out into the light. She realized that her fears and doubts that she had felt earlier had a basis. Aisha had always felt that there was more between them than she had realized. And now all the pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fit together. Now Aisha was faced with a choice. She could either accept this truth, realize that Adam was trying to protect her from his life of wealth and power, or she could back away, terrified that their worlds were too different to be together. Her love for him hadn't disappeared, but now it was more complicated, filled with new questions and fears. Aisha realized that her life would never be the same again. She knew she had many difficult decisions to make that would shape her future and her child's future. But one thing was certain: her story was just beginning, and Adam, as mysterious and powerful as he was, played a key role in it. It took Aisha a long time to come to her senses after discovering who the father of her child really was. The news that her lover Adam turned out to be a billionaire turned her life upside down. At first she couldn't believe it, her mind refusing to accept reality. It seemed to her that it was all just a strange dream from which she was about to wake up. But every time she tried to distract herself or convince herself that it was all a mistake, the facts came back to her again and again. It was true, and she had to accept it. At first, Aisha felt a great deal of shock and confusion. Her feelings were mixed and contradictory. On the one hand, she was stunned that the man she had fallen in love with turned out to be one of the most powerful and wealthy men in the world. On the other hand, she was tormented by doubts and fears. How would her life change now? What would happen to their relationship? And most importantly, what would this mean for her future and the future and the future of their child? Aisha knew she would have to rethink everything she knew about herself and her life. Before, she had seen herself as an ordinary girl struggling and trying to survive in a world full of injustice and suffering. But now, when it turned out that the father of her child was a billionaire, everything changed. She had to make a decision that would determine her future path. Aisha couldn't help but think about her future, which was now completely unpredictable. Previously, she had planned to cope on her own, despite her loneliness and poverty. She had prepared herself for the life of a single mother who would fight to survive for the sake of her child. But now that new opportunities opened up in front of her, her plans began to change. Aisha's first thought was that she would now be able to provide her child with a future that had previously seemed out of reach. All her fears about not being able to give her child enough gradually began to recede. She now had the confidence that her child would not need the essentials, that his life would be protected from the hardships she had gone through. Along with this confidence, however, an uneasiness settled in Aisha's heart. She knew that accepting Adam's help and recognizing his role in their lives meant accepting everything about his wealth and power. It meant immersing herself in a world that was completely foreign to her, where she would be judged not on her qualities, but on her connection to the billionaire. She feared that she would lose herself in this new world, that her own identity and history would be forgotten or distorted. Aisha began to realize that her feelings for Adam had changed as well. She still loved him, but now her love was complicated by new circumstances. She realized that her previous affection for him had been based on the fact that she saw him as an ordinary man, her equal. Now that his status had become obvious to her, she felt that an invisible wall had come up between them that would not be easily overcome. These reflections made Aisha feel even more lonely. She now found herself at a crossroads where she had to choose between her past and her future. Should she accept the life that Adam offered, with its luxuries and privileges, or continue to live by her principles, remaining true to herself and her history? Aisha also began to think about how this news would affect her relationships with those around her. Her family and friends, who had turned their backs on her during a difficult time, might come back into her life upon learning of Adam's wealth. But Aisha doubted the sincerity of these people. She didn't want to be surrounded only by money. She wanted to be valued for her personal qualities, not her connections to a billionaire. Eventually, Aisha realized that she would have to take responsibility not only for her future, but also for her child's future. She decided that she would approach any changes in her life carefully while maintaining her independence and dignity. She knew she couldn't go back to her past, but she also didn't want to fully immerse herself in a world that was foreign to her. Aisha decided to take some time to think about how she was going to organize her life. She realized that she would have some difficult decisions to make, but she also believed that she would be able to find a balance between her past and new life. Most importantly, she now knew that her future would not be lonely and bleak. She had support, even if it came from an unexpected source. Now she had to find a way to stay true to herself and at the same time give her child the best possible future. After much thought and worry, Aisha finally decided to meet with Adam to discuss their future and how to move forward with their relationship. This conversation was inevitable, and she realized that a lot depended on it. Aisha could no longer ignore the truth and avoid meeting the man who turned out to be not only the father of her child, but also one of the most powerful men in the world. When Aisha met Adam, she felt that things had changed between them. There was no longer the lightness and carefree attitude that had accompanied their relationship before. It was different now. Their bond had become much deeper, more complex and important. Aisha realized that she was not just her lover, but a man who could offer her and her child a future she had never dreamed of. But at the same time, she was afraid that their relationship might lose the sincerity and simplicity that was so important to her. During their meeting, Adam had opened up to her, sharing his true feelings and intentions. He offered his full support and expressed his desire to be involved in the child's life. Aisha saw genuine concern and responsibility in his eyes. It was not the mask she might have expected from a billionaire, but a genuine desire to be there and help. This moment was a turning point for her. She realized that despite his status and wealth, he was still the man she had come to love. However, Aisha realized that restoring their relationship would not be easy. She could no longer see Adam simply as a man with whom she had romantic feelings. He was now part of her future, and she needed to accept that and learn to live with that knowledge. Soon after their conversation, Aisha began accepting help from Adam, but on her own terms. She didn't want to be completely dependent on his money and influence, so she decided to keep working and maintain her independence. In addition, Aisha decided to take another step that was very important to her. She wanted to try to rebuild a relationship with her parents, despite all the pain and hurt they had caused her. In this matter, she again sought Adam's advice and support, and he helped her organize a meeting with her family. Aisha realized that this step would be difficult, but she no longer wanted to live apart from her family, especially now that she had a child. Meeting her parents was difficult and emotional. Aisha had long held a grudge against them for turning their backs on her at the most difficult time. But she also realized that they had their own reasons, fears and prejudices that made them make that decision. Aisha decided to give them a chance and try to understand them. While talking to her parents, she explained what she had been through and talked about how her life had changed. Aisha's parents were amazed by her candor and fortitude. They saw how their daughter had grown, how she had changed and become strong despite all the difficulties. This made them rethink their actions and realize that they had made a mistake in turning their backs on her. Gradually, Aisha and her parents began to rebuild their relationship, though not without difficulties. It was not an instant reconciliation, but it was a start, and both sides began to move towards each other. Now that Aisha's life was starting to get into a new groove, she felt that her future, though uncertain, was brighter. Her relationship with Adam, though it had changed, retained the warmth and sincerity that had been important to her from the beginning. Now they both realized that their connection was more than just a romantic relationship. It was responsibility, support, and a shared future they were willing to build together. Aisha also realized that her past no longer defined her, but it remained an important part of her identity. She had been through many challenges but had managed to maintain her strength and dignity. Now she was no longer alone and defenseless. She was surrounded by people who were there to support her, whether it was Adam or her family. She realized that despite her hardships, she had not lost herself, and this gave her the confidence that she could overcome any obstacles. Aisha had new challenges and decisions ahead of her, but now she knew she had the support and strength to face them. She was ready to embrace her new life and build her future with those who were dear to her heart. Her journey was far from over, but now she walked it with confidence and hope, knowing that there were challenges ahead, but also joys to be shared with those she loved.